Hello, everybody. Welcome. On behalf of the county, Canaan and Associates, and DPZ Co-Design, welcome to the first meeting of Series 2 of 3. My name is Marina Corey, and I'm a partner with DPZ. And tonight's presentation will be led by Matt Lambert, another one of our partners. And we're excited to be here for the Series 2 of 3 series. So as a reminder, Series 1 was an introduction to the comprehensive plan and the particularities of each of the 6 market areas. It provided detailed references about each area of the county to assist us all in better celebrating the general character of each area, but also understanding the individuality of each area. And the rest of the Series 2 meetings are going to take place this week and next. So this series is an introduction to sectors and place types, 2 terms that you're going to learn about today. And they are intended to further help identify as ways in which we can grow in a more predictable manner, in a way that supports the mayor's initiatives and the initiatives of the comprehensive plan and the goals of the comprehensive plan. Series 3 in late spring will be about the zoning code, the zoning regulations intended to support those policies that will help further guide not only growth, development, but also conservation. So we look forward to your active participation, collaboration, and engagement with our team as we collectively map and describe the way in which the county should grow over the next few decades. No easy feat. But a couple of rules, housekeeping rules, before we begin the presentation. First, we want to thank you all for participating, and we encourage you to alert your neighbors and your friends to participate in these meetings because we're covering important topics. This meeting is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Vision 2050 website, which is indicated here. It's also being streamed live to the Orange County social media. We encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A button, and throughout this presentation, we'll be gathering those questions, the questions that come through the county's Facebook page as well as Twitter, and we will answer them in real time when Matt is done with the presentation and halfway through his presentation as well. The meeting is focused, as I mentioned, on two primary topics, the sectors and place types. And as I indicated, the future meetings are going to cover additional comprehensive plan topics. They may provide further feedback into these place types and sectors, and also show the intersection with the actual zoning codes and how they all lay over with each other. Information about this general process can be found on the website. Now, today's particular meeting is to inform residents about key features of the future land use map within the comprehensive plan. There are going to be welcoming remarks by Alberto Vargas, the planning director, as well as some of the commissioners, possibly. We're going to do a general overview of sectors and place types, then a deeper dive into sectors. We'll then take questions, maybe start a discussion amongst ourselves. And then there'll be a second half of the presentation, which will be Matt presenting the place types, and then again, an opportunity to ask other questions. So the website is here. If you want to know more, I'm going to now turn it over to Alberto Vargas.
Thank you very much, Marina. Welcome, everybody. I am very excited to be here tonight. We're kicking off this second series of town hall meetings. As Maria already mentioned, there is quite a bit that we have already covered with the first series, and we tried to be extremely sensitive to the different geography or geographical conditions of the county. That is really the foundation of this dialogue that we've started back in December of last year and ended in January with trying to be very meticulous about the overall delineation of what the larger geographical approach towards understanding Orange County is really all about. We went market area by market area, all 6 market areas of the county identified here on the screen today. They help us from a planning perspective really begin to organize the foundation of this overall approach, really understand the character and diversity of the county, and they will also help us continue to provide order to the final document, which is going to be that vision plan, that comprehensive plan. As Maria mentioned, we are starting tonight with the second series. We're gonna have 3 particular meetings this week. Wednesday and Thursdays are the 2 following meetings, which are going to focus on the Northwest market area and the core market area. The following week, next week, we're going to again have engagement opportunities with you on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, covering the rest of the 3 market areas that are left, the East, the Rural East, and the Southwest. The same order as the first town hall meeting. So hopefully if you participated in the South market area during the first meeting of the first series, hopefully we have some of you or most of you participating tonight as well. As Marina also mentioned, we are going to dive tonight into the sectors and the place types. The sectors themselves, the way that the planning team has already identified those, is really the vision map. They really begin to identify general areas of the county that begins to delineate how the policy of growth for the next 30 years is going to be set for areas that will show some level of development, redevelopment, and areas that will stay pretty much the same as they are today. And we're going to develop with a collective approach, those policies to move forward. The place types, as you will continue to engage your vetting process tonight of how this is being developed, we're going to talk a little bit more about the future land uses and how those areas are going to describe future communities and existing communities. It will describe in detail the intended character of those communities, the mix of uses that are going to take place within those newly created communities, and the levels of densities and intensities, you know, how intense those areas are going to be for the purpose of planning places, which is a slightly different lens than Orange County Planning and Orange County staff has looked at the planning process for the duration before we started this initiative tonight. So with that, I'm looking forward to the dialogue tonight. I appreciate your time, and I'm going to also welcome the presence of District 1 Commissioner tonight, Commissioner Wilson. Commissioner, welcome, and I'd like to give you an opportunity of any welcoming remarks at this time.
Thank you so much, Alberto. I hope you can hear me. I am very grateful to you and all the hard work that you and your team have put into this ongoing process. And I think that these community meetings are really going to be the key to actually making this vision a reality. So thank you again. And if anybody out there who is in District 1 is curious, that's sort of that southwest market area. And even if you aren't a citizen there and you want to get in touch with us, please do not hesitate to reach out to the District 1 office. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now I'm going to welcome District Commissioner 4, Commissioner Gomez Cordero. Welcome. Any opening remarks tonight?
Thank you, Alberto. Welcome, everyone. And thank you all for this town hall meeting on Vision 2050. I am so happy to be here. If there's anyone from District 4 in this meeting, if you have any question after this presentation, you can always call my office. And thank you, Alberto, and all the Orange County staff that is here and that have been working in this project. Bless you and good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. I know we have also presence from District Office 3, Commissioner Uribe. I'm not sure if she's present, but if Cortez or anybody else would like to say anything tonight, welcome.
I'm here, Alberto. Hi there.
Oh, Commissioner, how are you?
How are you?
I apologize.
No problem at all. I again also want to welcome everyone who's on this call and really give a big, I guess, shout out to Orange County staff, because this is their passion that has driven this project and really to engage Orange County residents and what the future of Orange County will look like. And this is just an example, but what we need is we need you guys to help get the word out. This call should have 200-300 people on it. And we want to see that happen. If you can help us spread the word out to residents from all over, you don't have to live in that region to participate. It's just a way that the county has done this to help, you know, isolate, because if you live in District 3, we're actually split in 2 projects here. So it doesn't matter, but what we do know is that all of us here can agree that we want you to be a part of that vision. And that vision starts with you participating, giving us feedback, and just staying engaged in Orange County government as we really set the platform for what we're going to look at for the next 20 and 30 years. So I thank you. And I also want to reiterate, if there's ever we can be of service, if there's ever any comments you want to bring to us individually, we are happy to also pass those along to the staff. But I will say that the staff on this call really care about this, and they would welcome any feedback and what we could do better and what we could do to get the word out. So thank you all for being here tonight on a Monday night and sharing your time and hopefully your ideas with our vision. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night and look forward to participating.
Thank you, Commissioner. I know we had early registrations from District 6 Commissioner Siplin. Not sure if you're on. I have a very limited window to see who's participating, but if you are, please welcome and any welcoming remarks. Very good. If I missed anybody, any one of the commissioners that may be present, please go ahead and welcome and thank you for being with us tonight.
And so I think on that note, we're going to turn it over to Matt to begin the presentation.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Alberto and Maria. Thanks for that introduction. And today we really want to help you understand the pieces of this vision. If you didn't attend the last series of meetings, the videos are available on the Vision 2050 website. All of these complex topics here were addressed to frame the importance of a comprehensive plan. Much of the general public may not know what a comprehensive plan is, really. There are many topics covered, such as how much the county will grow, the generational dynamics of growth and aging, the formats growth may occur in, what affects housing affordability, and whether people have transportation options, where some places are more connected to regional transportation than others, new mobility technologies, and what the current state of planning is, how zoning works with a comprehensive plan, and so on. There was a lot covered in this last round, and luckily all these are recorded. This will be recorded and available for review. So if you need to go back and absorb the concepts, please do. Quite a lot must be considered when developing a vision. And this vision, Vision 2050, is looking forward 30 years. 30 years is quite a long time. If we just jump back 6 times, we're in 1840, when sewing machines just hit the street. The last 30 years took us from early personal computers in homes that could afford them to advanced computers in our pockets, on our wrists, in our cars, and managing autonomous rovers on Mars. Where will we go in the next 30 years? Comprehensive plans are designed to look towards a distant future and to align all the policies and activities of the county towards a shared future vision. Orange County is a hotbed of innovation and home to a diverse and growing population. As we look at growth management, we have to consider how to grow while protecting sensitive natural lands and the county's rural heritage, to grow in ways that increase equity and affordability, mobility options and access to jobs, and places for friends, family, and fun. As a reminder, the current comprehensive plan was adopted in 2009. There's quite a lot of information in there, and the Vision 2050 plan will also have a lot of content. But today we're going to focus on growth and development policies and the way that Vision 2050 leads the county towards a future vision. A major component of that is really, what is the projection of growth? We're going to talk a lot about growth and growth management, clearly. The county has been growing steadily, as you can see in this chart. Just like tracking hurricanes, though, the extent of the future is uncertain, but we have a pretty good idea of the path, which leads towards significant growth in the next 30 years. That prior chart took the midpoint at about 690,000 people. That's quite a lot of new neighbors, and we should think about them as new neighbors and friends. The city of Orlando, for example, has a population of 280,000 people. So this growth is about 2.5 times the population within the city of Orlando. But to think that growth would occur evenly across the whole county is just bad planning. And to allow growth in this form would be bad policy, resulting in a degraded quality of life by increasing the amount of time people spend driving, the cost of infrastructure and tax burden, and reducing rural and natural lands. I hope we can agree that these are not desirable outcomes. So what we're looking at is a vision to define the outcomes that we all want to see. We plan in order to direct growth to specific places, not everywhere. One of the 2 components of growth management is sectors. Sectors direct growth to where it should be encouraged. We also plan in order to direct the character of new development in those places where growth is desirable. When we consider the county as a whole, It's quite a diverse place and should continue to offer people a diversity of options for where to live, diverse job opportunities and educational choices, and diverse ways to get around. Place types direct the character of future growth through form, intensity, and the mixture of uses and mobility. So the sectors are large and place types fall within them. Together, these two tools direct growth towards a vision. Where growth occurs and the character it takes is a key component of Vision 2050. These live in the future land use component of the comprehensive plan. Sectors determine where growth will occur, and place types determine the form that growth will take. We're spending all of today on these two components. Most residents don't interact daily or directly with the comprehensive plan or future land use. We hope that Vision 2050 as a document is one that everyone can understand, that you can contribute to the vision, and that it builds a clear expectation for the future. So there's a larger overall picture that these sectors and place types fall into. We've talked a little on market areas. So I just wanted to touch on some of these elements. Certain things are policy while others are not. At the top, there's the incorporated municipalities. These are places that determine their own growth policies. So the comprehensive plan, while coordinating with those municipalities, does not control them. Next are the market areas. The reason we're in the South market area meeting today. These are really a tool that allows us to zoom in on different parts of the county to look more closely at the differences in character, analyze those places, understand their history, engage with people who live and work there, and consider how policies should react to different contexts. Next below that is the urban service area. This is really a policy boundary that determines where utility service will be offered. So there's areas within it that can grow more intensely and areas outside of it that cannot. It's an indirect growth policy in that it limits where that urban versus rural standpoint, that change occurs. Now, the following three elements, the subjects of this town hall and the series following it, series 3, they work together to control the intensity and form of growth. Today, we'll look at sectors and place types, as we said. In the next town hall series, we'll look at Orange Code. So let's just jump into the sectors. Now remember, sectors determine where growth can occur. They also determine the amount of growth in each area through the place types that are allowed. Technically, they limit the different place types, which are the new future land use categories. We'll look at these after the sectors, but first we want to understand the sectors. And to understand these, we want to first think about the idea of where growth should be. Here, there, not over here. So these are the 6 sectors in Vision 2050 on the left. As a reminder, though, the upper right shows incorporated areas, just to remind us that they're not included in the sectors specifically, and the areas when we look at percentages are outside of that. So in terms of sectors, at the top is the targeted sector. These are the growth priority areas. Following this is the intended sector, where existing area-wide plans have been developed and where existing developments and plan developments have already been approved and entitled. These 2 sectors are where nearly all future growth is directed. Following these are the established and rural sectors, generally retaining their current character, and then the preserved sector for large and contiguous preserved natural areas. At the bottom is the special sector. That's really for more complicated land uses like power plants and water treatment, airports, and universities. These places have sort of atypical characteristics and they need special attention that's different from really the sort of normative growth and normative development that we see elsewhere. And here's how they break down in land area. The vast majority of the county is within the preserved, rural, and established sectors, where a significant amount of growth is discouraged. Instead, growth is directed to the targeted and intended sectors, roughly 12% of the county, the unincorporated county. So to zoom out, here's the sort of pie chart view for comparison. Incorporated areas and the road rights of way. Why are roads in there? Because when we look at all these land uses, we're looking at individual properties, and roads take up quite a lot of space across the county. So the incorporated areas and roads are quite significant, but really not as much as what falls into the preserved and rural sectors. Areas prioritized for development in the targeted and intended sectors remain a small percentage. So let's take a closer look at each sector. First, the areas where significant growth is discouraged. These are the simplest. And then to areas where growth is encouraged. Here's an overall map of the county. We'll see how sectors are mapped at a countywide level, and then zoom into the South Market area for a closer look. Incorporated areas cover about 24% of the county. We've only labeled a few of them here just for your orientation and for legibility. If we tried to put everything on there, you couldn't read anything at all. These areas manage their own growth policies, and sectors apply only to the unincorporated areas. The preserved sector is simplest of all. These are lands currently in preservation or with policies directing for future preservation. The sector includes really only the large and contiguous areas in preservation. Many developments may have additional smaller conservation elements, and those tend to fall into the established sector or some of the other sectors. And we'll see that later in the place types. But the preserved sector covers very large systems and large areas in preservation. So this is the preserved sector as mapped presently. About 21% of the unincorporated county falls into this, including Lake Apopka. So it's quite a large area, but still there are significant pieces of preservation connected open areas included. Let's look at the rural sector. This includes lands in agricultural use, pasture lands, rural settlements, and large undeveloped lands where growth is discouraged in the future, as well as natural areas that are not yet preserved. Here's the rural sector mapped. Like the preserved sector, the rural sector covers about 21% of unincorporated Orange County. Most of this, of course, to the east, but some to the west, especially between Winter Garden and all the Disney properties. So the established sector, now we're getting into sectors that really are places that have development. The established sector includes most of the county's existing residential areas where there's a goal to maintain the current character. Mapped, the established sector is really the residential areas surrounding and between incorporated areas. This includes about 13% of unincorporated Orange County. And later we'll see the detail of where this lands in the South Market area, which may be able to clarify a little bit more, but really essentially all of the low intensity and single family neighborhoods throughout the county fall into the established sector with the goal of preserving character. So when we add these together, these three sectors, you can see the areas where growth is generally discouraged. And that comprises about 55% of unincorporated Orange County. So if you have kids, and I have a 6-year-old, or if you spend a lot of time around them, you may be familiar with this new food mantra of go slow and whoa, that encourage kids to eat lots of healthy foods, those are the goes, to not eat too many processed foods, the slows, and to rarely eat sweets and treats, the woes. We can look at the sector map really in the same light, with the whoa areas where we want to discourage growth, like the preserved and rural sectors, slow areas like the established sector. Not much change, but people often will rebuild their house or make additions and whatnot. And we'll also look at the go areas, which are next. The intended sector includes areas that have already been planned for new growth, including entitled developments and area-wide plans. These have already been created and approved prior to now. This sector represents about 5.5% of the county and includes areas like Horizon West, Innovation Way, and Lake Pickett. And lastly, the targeted sector. This is where most new growth will be encouraged. This sector includes existing commercial, industrial, and higher density residential land located along the county's major roadway network and areas along its future planned transit routes. This is the targeted sector mapped, represented about 6% of unincorporated Orange County. The targeted sector is heavily concentrated on the I-4 corridor and also includes quite a bit of the South Industrial area, as well as major roadways leading to incorporated areas. Together, these are the sectors where growth is encouraged, about 11.5% of unincorporated Orange County. Then to fill the gap, there's the special sector thing. A small amount of the county overall, I think is about 3.5%, yes. This includes places like UCF, the power plants, the prison, the golf center, and other special places that don't really fit the rules of a shopping center or a residential neighborhood or something that is what we might say is normative. So when we add them all together, we get a full sector map that covers all of the unincorporated county. And this map directs where growth should occur and how much should occur in any given area. Or from a go slow whoa standpoint, it looks like this. The whoa areas, areas where growth is discouraged, the slow areas that just naturally grow a little bit over time, and the go areas where we want to see future infill development and development that improves the quality of life for everyone in the county. So let's zoom into the South Market area now and see how the sectors are mapped over here. Now, much of the South Market area is within the city of Orlando, outlined here, about 40% of this market area, and much of that's really the airport. Here's the preserve sector. A significant amount of this is near Lake Hart, and preserved lands to the west are in between developments, and those are areas to remain in preservation. The rural sector is principally on the east end, covering existing rural areas. This is 10% of this market area. The established sector covers 15% of the area, mostly to the west and along the eastern edge of the unincorporated areas. As you may recognize, this is mostly existing neighborhoods. There are some large areas that are not yet preserved at the larger scale of the preserve sector, but are in conservation easements within existing developments. So these also occur within the established sector. Again, areas aimed to preserve the current character. So the no and low growth sectors make up about 35% of the market area, which is about the same amount as the city of Orlando. And together, the city and the no and low growth sectors comprise about 74% of the market area. So where is growth encouraged? Well, here's the intended sector. This includes Innovation Way, the area-wide plan, and that's about 7% of the market area. And then this is the targeted sector. This covers much of the South Industrial area, highway-oriented commercial properties, and existing higher density residential and mixed-use areas. For instance, the part of Hunters Creek that's mapped in the sector is essentially fully built out, but it's at the density and intensity generally intended for the target sector. And so while the targeted sector covers 10% of the market area, we wouldn't assume that this would all redevelop in the next 30 years. Rather, should there be demand for growth, depending upon that growth projection, it is intended to be directed towards these areas and away from other areas that are aimed at preservation of character, rural lands or natural areas. Together, the growth sectors are 17%. And as discussed in the intended sector, this already includes areas planned for growth today, and the targeted sector areas where growth in the future would be encouraged. And back to this go slow woe standpoint, here's how the map breaks down for the South Market area. Over to the west, I switched coasts, so my west and east are backwards sometimes. So over to the west is most of the encouraged growth areas, while over to the east is most of the areas in preservation. And so here's the composite sector map. And hopefully this was simple enough to understand the sectors. The next topic we'll discuss is place types, and sectors influence place types. We'll clarify that for you. But before we move on, we'd like to see if there are any questions from attendees or viewers, or items that the county or consultant team would like to add on the subject of sectors.
So Matt, there are a couple of questions, but I wanted to ask a couple first. That I think maybe your presentation on sectors was good, but two questions that maybe not people would have is there a minimum size to a sector? And why is a sector needed? Why instead of the flu, right? Or the future land use? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, there's not specifically a minimum size for a sector, but we aim to have as much contiguity as we can in a sector. Now, the target is a little bit different, but you can think about it like natural systems. So you'd like to have the preserved sector connect a wetland system or preserve a large area of rural lands. But in terms of targeted areas, we do find a lot more smaller pieces, like a small neighborhood retail center that may be encouraged for change or preservation in the future. And the same goes for the established sector, where there may be a small area of established single family that change is not encouraged for, but it may be surrounded by other places where change is encouraged. We'll actually look at that with the area around Taft when we get into place types. Now, repeat the second question again.
The second question was why is it needed instead of just the flu?
Yeah, so this establishes a vision of where we want to see growth versus the place types, which are the future land use, and that's how we want to see it occur. Now, Alberto's talked about going from a comprehensive plan to a vision plan, where the prior ways of managing future land use tended to be more reactionary, to react to the way that the market is approaching new development. And that doesn't really create a cohesive future for the county. So moving towards a vision plan, in this case, we want to be able to say, in these targeted areas, we want growth to look like X, which is going to be more intensive than, say, the established areas where we want to not have a significant amount of change. Now, if we went to just a future land use is much easier to change, right? I mean, it still takes time, but there's nothing that says in this area, we don't really want to see a high intensity mixed use center, or in this area, we really do want to see that, right? It's hard to say if you're just going from future land use. So this is an additional layer that essentially says, in these areas, these are the land use types that we'd like to see. And in these areas, we want to see these other types. And so it really helps you allocate where different forms of development can occur.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think it's also about looking at different scales of planning, right? So the future land use looks at a parcel level, the same way that zoning looks at a parcel level. What we're trying to do here is introduce different scales of planning so that we can begin to identify character areas and growth or preservation areas, right?
Yeah, correct.
Great. So then we've had a couple of people ask questions about transportation, and so I could group them together, but essentially here are two questions, because I think it's important to speak about the the intersection between transportation and land use planning. So the first one is we need more transit-oriented development and other modes of travel. I think the county is certainly working towards that. How will the county enable this to happen with Vision 2050? And I think maybe Alberto wants to answer this, as well as to what extent will this plan have policies that encourage rideshare, telecommuting, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if
Well,
Matt,
I can cover the
Yeah.
first half of it, but I think I'll ask Alberto on the policy question. But the first half, in terms of transit-oriented development, we'll see that shortly as we get into place types. But the sector, the targeted sector, for instance, is mapped along transit routes, existing and future transit routes, major roadways, and at these intersections. Now, the goal, as we'll see in the place type discussion, is to encourage for infill development to create centers of activity and higher density at nodes where transportation works effectively. And then there are also corridors that are mapped along transit routes to encourage those as places for increased population versus increasing in places that are not accessible to transportation systems.
Yeah, Alberto, we know that it's very much the whole transportation picture is very much a part of the plan, the Orange County 2050, the Vision 2050. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Marina. But basically, as we go back into just the recent history that has revealed this planning process and the actual lens of planning, that the way that we're beginning to look through the lens of the next 30 years is really anchor and identify existing major employment centers and projected employment centers as we navigate our way through these interesting times of the economic situation in Orange County. But the established employment centers and how they're connected to each other in areas that continue to be studied in terms of alternative analysis for transportation alternatives. Those corridors that connect those employment centers to each other really begin to reveal the framework and the skeleton, if you would, of this targeted sector as you have presented it tonight. Basically, that overall boundary area identifies future corridors for alternative modes of transportation and moving away from the dependency of the automobile to connect those major employment centers and some that are maybe in the making right now along those corridors as well. So it is revealing to better understand the vision of the targeted as the foundation that really creates the overall boundary of that particular area.
So,
and I would add that there's, to be effective for other modes of transportation, you need both walkable places that are mixed use and diverse, so that you can viably walk and roll, and you need to have centers of sort of concentrated activity at jobs, entertainment, population, such that you can more easily connect to each other. And that really the way that land use and the future land use plan through place types is intended through this is to encourage that type of growth, such that both the land use supports transportation and the transportation can then support land use.
Good. And now I'm going to group two questions on affordable housing. The first one is maybe for Alberto, and the second one can be Matt. The first one is, what are specific policies will the 2050 plan have to encourage affordable housing? And the second one says, which we agree with, we need to upzone single family zones for higher intensity use to make Orlando more affordable by building enough housing to meet demand. What are the county's plan to upzone major corridors like Simoran? And I think, Matt, maybe you can talk a little bit about the targeted sectors and even the intended. so that we can explain that it's not everything that gets zoned for higher intensity, but certain areas that have been identified that can accommodate it. And then maybe Alberto can speak to the bigger picture.
Okay, so switch the order. You want me to go first?
It doesn't matter, either one.
Well, sure. And Summarin's good because we'll look at it in a little bit. It's an example of the place types, and that'll show how the sectors and place types are intended to concentrate development at these nodes of activity and then along the transportation corridors. The one we'll look at in particular happens to have a lot of land that's in incorporated municipalities. But you'll see when we talk about the sectors where we've defined what we call neighborhood fabric, and there are some that are more diverse and intense than others, and those are allocated towards the corridors, towards the centers, and also in the next series of meetings we'll look at the code, and the code has also gone quite a long way to encourage the diversification of housing in many different contexts, including in these centers where quite a bit of housing in general and attainable and affordable housing can be provided. But concerning policy, Alberto, I'll turn that over to you.
Sure, thank you, Matt. Just in the topic of affordable housing, I think it's always important to tie the dependency between affordability and transportation needs, as well as how each one begin to work towards beginning to address the crisis that we have in both general areas, really. Orange County has identified for the last 3 years with a regional affordable housing initiative, and now an accepted 10-year action plan via Housing for All, that we have a specific target. We know how the next 10 years of growth in terms of the housing land use in Orange County will take place. And if that number is north of 86,000 units, the plan itself, this 10-year action plan, intends to target just over 30%, close to 35% of that entire number of housing solutions, with a diverse amount of different strategies to begin to move the needle, if you would, of the crisis that we have. So as part of that 10-year action plan, we have very specific regulatory incentives as well as financial incentives to help address with the development programs that introduce the land use of housing and residential land uses, to begin to take into consideration the diversity of housing product types, opportunities where those diverse housing product types and mixed income solutions would be able to be part of the new communities and new neighborhoods. We have a very specific tool that helps us identify those areas of opportunities, and that is in the accessibility and opportunity tool that highlights pretty much very consistent to what the targeted area is, where it identifies parcels that rank higher than 60 out of 100%, which would be suitable for this to begin to tap into these specific incentives, both the regulatory and the financial incentives. So this is an ongoing dialogue. The 10-year action plan is very specific about changes that we are beginning to introduce, as you mentioned, Matt, in our Orange Code, which implements Vision 2050, how to modify and eliminate those existing barriers that are in our regulations today that prohibit or make affordable housing solutions very difficult in the county.
So, Alberto, I'm going to ask of you another question, but I also wanted to add to what you just said, because when we speak about affordable, what the zoning code is intended to do is also introduce a lot of new types, because very often people tend to think of affordable in one kind of building type, but what the zoning code is doing is really expanding the types of building types that are compatible, especially with the single family neighborhoods. And we also, that's also in recognition of the real demographic changes that are occurring around the country, and the fact that, you know, depending on where you are, you know, 60% of households in this country are composed of one or two people households, so that are looking for something other than just a single family house. So I think that's important to note. So to piggyback onto the question of, you talked about, you know, the opportunities that you identified. One of the questions is, what is the projected population for Orange County by 2050? And how many new residents are anticipated between now and then? So is it a sort of a consistent arc going up?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the introduction today kind of revealed that 2.1 million people by 2050, 48% growth between 2020 and 2050.
Got it. All right.
Which was about 690,000 people.
Yep.
Or 2.5 times the city of Orlando.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to move into the rural area, because there are again two questions that I can try pair together. The first one is, well, actually more than two, but two of them are aligned. Why is the rural sector on the east boundary interrupted by an intended sector? And will there be transitions between rural and intended areas? And will there be policy overrides for already established areas like Innovation Way? So the intended, well, Matt, maybe you want to speak to the character of the intended sector.
But I'd actually, I think Alberto would be able to answer that best for the specific area-wide plan that's in place over there.
And I'm going to ask, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
The question is, well, so the intended sector are really, I'm going to try answer a little part of it, which is the intended sectors are really where there are PDs that have already been permitted, right? And where growth already, or growth has already been permitted in anticipation of, well, the growth is expected and is part of what we know is coming, and where growth has been directed for the next few years. That's what the intended sector is, correct? It's a lot of your existing PDs.
That is correct, yes.
And Marina, the question, this is Marcus, by the way, the question was specifically, why do we have that huge yellow between the two greens? And that's the intended sector. That's because that is exactly what the Innovation Way area is. So we had a very large planning area, you know, what it's almost 15, 20 years ago. That's the Innovation Way that you see in yellow there. That's the intended sector growth. Because we have those policies, the goal of that area is to recognize those policies. So that answers kind of the second question. Are we going to override them? No, the intent is not to try to redo the planning that was on for those areas. That's why they are there. And even though it shows as an interrupted area, it doesn't mean that that entire area will be actually, you know, like paved over. The idea is that in that you do have the green systems that you can practically see on this map over the yellow. The darker areas are areas that are natural and wetlands, and those areas will be preserved for sure.
Great. And so then two more very good questions. The first one is has to deal with process. How will the county modify sector boundaries as future needs arise? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I just think that the sectors themselves hopefully will be agreed upon as part of this visioning process. The idea here is not for the general areas that have been determined to be intended or established or targeted to be modified aggressively over time. Obviously, there are areas that will continue to be adjusted. Again, these are not regulatory lines for the sectors themselves. They are vision lines which are blurred to a certain degree. So generally, areas that are adjacent to targeted areas could continue to expand slightly from their existing conditions. And that will be very well determined by the place types themselves and how well they begin to transition from one level of density and intensity to the other. Remember, compatibility is going to continue to be the fundamental decision-driven process for what would be consistent with this Vision 2050. So just to be clear, the actual lines that you see for each one of these sectors are not regulatory. They are part of the vision, and they're intended to continue to be the foundation of how we're moving forward. They may change slightly, but hopefully the intent tonight, and as we continue to develop this overall approach, will be to keep them as close as possible to the final product before the Vision 2050 is adopted.
Great. And I'm going to ask one more before we proceed with the place types presentation, because we're coming up on 7 o'clock. But this is an important question too. And I think I'm going to direct it to you, Alberto, because it speaks to the history in Orange County. But that is, and this is a problem that many cities face, which is, to what extent do you think the rural areas have contributed to the urban sprawl? The fact that there's so much limited development, I'm presuming, in the rural area. How has that contributed to urban sprawl in Orange County?
Well, I think in Orange County, traditionally, we have had the urban service area and the rural service area with very specific policy of expansion to the rural service area. And the policies that are existing in today's comprehensive plan, the 2010-2030 comprehensive plan, the document that houses all the goals, objectives, and policies of the county, really had the intention of preventing as much as possible sprawl by limiting utilities expansion to those particular areas, by embracing the character of existing lifestyles in the areas that are rural. But obviously, the reality in the market today, and it will continue to be the pressure in the future, is that those lifestyles, the parcels themselves in rural character, tend to be extremely attractive to many of the elements of the development community for different reasons, economic reasons. The price of land may be a lot more affordable because of the character of them, and opportunities of undeveloped land to become something else. So I think that with the vision plan itself, we will be able to be a little bit more assertive as to changes that may happen to the rural East Market area, if any. And this is a very well calibrated approach towards infill in those areas that will not be sprawl in any given reason, because of the way that certain communities will continue to develop in the targeted sector within the urban service area, and how new communities will continue to behave themselves in terms of growth adjacent to the targeted areas and established areas as you continue to approach that rural service area of the county.
Terrific. Thank you, Alberto. And there's two last questions. I won't ask them now, because what it is specific. People are questioning specific locations such as the I-4 corridor and the Florida Mall, and wondering why they've been designated a special sector or a particular sector designation. And these are the exact type of feedback that we all want, so that we can be going to modify and make these adjustments as this process moves forward. So we'll hold off on those particular ones, and I'm going to let Matt move into the place types now.
Well, sure, but you of course want to call out the Vision 2050 website as a place to find some additional opportunities for feedback and surveys and so forth. For these, but we'll have another section of questions and discussions here after we get through place types.
Yeah, and I think it's worth waiting for you to do your presentation on place types and to answer those two questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let's dive into place types. So first we covered the sectors so we can refer to them. It's interesting, of course, that some of the questions were related to that which place types will manage. And the sectors really determine what is appropriate in terms of place types for a given area. Some types are of a higher intensity and density than others. Some are lesser density and intensity. The targeted sector, for instance, encourages infill, and it permits place types of a higher intensity than does the established sector, which aims to maintain character, permitting place types of a lower intensity. But place types aren't only about density and intensity, which maybe those of you familiar with future land use are used to. Place types go a little beyond that singular property and look at the character of a smaller area, not so much as the sectors, but an area of a few hundred acres as an example. So the place types really determine how growth can occur through physical characteristics like heights, block structure, the mix of uses, along with density and intensity. Many place type details are regulated in the zoning code update, Orange Code, and we'll discuss that in the next town hall series. But the place types will have control over really the zones that are in there. So in the comprehensive plan, place types are the future land use categories, and they regulate density and mix of uses, the allowable mix of zones, and describe the intended character of new development and of existing places. So the place types, there's a few of them, not as many as old future land use categories, so it's a little simpler, but there's still quite a bit. And so we organize these into 4 categories. The urban place types, which are applicable within the urban service area, and we'll see later which ones are related to which sectors. The rural place types, which are applicable outside of the urban service area. Open space place types, and these cover natural areas and the larger parks in the county. So these are sort of everywhere. And special place types that are similar to the special sector, areas that need special rules or considerations like universities, industrial districts, theme parks, airports, utility districts, and so forth. So first we'll cover the easy ones. The open space types are the simplest. There's 2 types, parks and recreation, and natural areas, and both of these may be located in all sectors. You'll see on the right this access and density and landscape, just as relative ways to compare one to the other. Natural areas are wonderful for landscape preservation, but there's not a lot of people around them necessarily, and they don't have great access to transportation systems. Parks bring a wonderful landscape into places that are generally developed with some people nearby and a little bit of access, more so than natural areas. Parks and recreations, as I said, cover the larger county parks and recreation facilities. These may be added to really any sector in the future, and many exist in all sectors today. These enhance the surrounding areas and tend to be located closer to places where people live. Natural areas are places set aside for conservation. Now, of course, the preservation sector is full of natural areas, but they're also found in all other sectors, as of course most new development has some area of conservation and preservation that's a part of them. These are both within the preserve sector, but also on preservation and conservation lands outside of it. So that was pretty easy. And the rural place types are also relatively easy as well. There's just a few of them. So the rural types are divided into 3 categories located within the rural sector. They're all low density or very low density in character, with landscape and regional character preservation as a goal. You see the types here, the rural villages and hamlets, settlements, and rural lands. And I'll describe each of them, but as you can see, in general, access is difficult, as I think that transportation question brought up. Access is difficult in rural areas, but where there are places that settlements have concentrated, those tend to have an increased access to services and transportation. Slightly more people, but not nearly as much as some of the built up areas in the other sectors. So rural villages and hamlets, these are walkable places within the rural landscape, surrounded by land that's in rural use or natural areas. These are really rare, but they provide necessary services and some increased transportation access in that rural landscape. Of course, there's the rural settlements. Those are well known. We don't need to go into a lot of detail. These are very low density developed areas within that rural landscape and generally assigned for preservation of character. And then rural lands are those areas that we think of when we consider the rural environment. They have little to no development and are principally agricultural or pastoral in use. So again, simple. And the last simple one is the special place types. So just like the special sector, these types don't fit into the urban or rural categories, yet they're key components of Orange County. And these places require special rules and special consideration. So we've identified, industrial, institutional, and entertainment as examples of place types in this category. There's more, such as utility corridors and whatnot, but you can get an idea of what they are and why they are from these types. So the urban place types, this is actually where the bit of complexity comes in, but it also speaks to some of those questions about where affordable housing may be located and how to enhance the transportation and land use coordination across the county. So the details of these will focus on for most of the remainder of this. So the urban place types, they're further divided into 3 categories, and we mentioned them a bit in the questions. There are centers, corridors, and neighborhood fabric. Each of these categories has 3 types within them, totally 9. It may seem like a lot, but compared to the existing categories, it's a lot shorter and hopefully a little simpler and more organized. The goal is really to better communicate what the expectations are and the vision for the future. The centers are the most intense, where mixed use occurs at the higher end of density. Corridors connect those centers to each other, and the neighborhood fabric surrounds centers and corridors. And as you can see from the access density and landscape, that really the centers, because they're centers of activity, have the most intensity, the most density, and the most access to mobility. Corridors similarly have quite a bit of mobility access, but less so than those nodes. And as such, the sort of density and intensity is lower. And then the neighborhood fabric ends up with less density and less mobility access because they go hand in hand. So a diagram may help to illustrate this condition. Centers are typically located at the intersection of major roadways. They're intended to be mixed use and vibrant in the future. Places for higher density and the convergence of different mobility options, as well as being places for jobs and for entertainment. The lowest intensity center is called the neighborhood center. These are small, not generally non-residential, but also some mixed use areas. But they may span just a block or two, maybe 8 blocks. It's not a huge area typically, but it's a lower intensity mixed use area providing services and activity to surrounding residences. These exist today in both the established and targeted sectors. And most of the ones that are in the established, actually the established ones are mapped with the targeted sector. So they're all in the targeted sector today. And they're intended to be enhanced and encouraged, but not to be significantly intensified necessarily. Because that's in the urban and regional centers. These are the most intense of the place types that you may associate with mixed use and vibrant places. Urban centers are the lower of the urban versus regional center, with buildings around, say, 4 stories on a connected street grid, mixing non-residential and residential uses. They're places for entertainment, services, job. They're places that have a good percentage of population who would like to work and live and walk, especially younger and older folks. Now, regional centers, those are more intensive, sort of akin to downtown, for lack of better reference. A regional center is planned for iDrive to become a key destination for the region. So that really falls into that category, much higher intensity. Now, between the centers are the corridors which connect them. Generally, these are along transportation routes, which provide access opportunities, but corridors are less dense than centers. And they also need to carefully transition in intensity towards the surrounding neighborhoods. Much of that is handled in the Orange Code section, though addressed in the place types within the comprehensive plan as well. So of the corridors, there are main streets, and these exist throughout the county, and the lowest intensity of really all the bunch. They're low in scale, and often the existing ones are not mixed use. But these corridors provide important services to nearby residents, and many could benefit from things like street trees, obviously bike racks here, along with a code that encourages them to flourish and the ability to infill some residential as well. Then you have transit corridors. Transit corridors are located along existing and future transit routes. Because these have greater transit access, they're intended to be higher in density and intensity to connect people, to connect housing with quality transit and jobs. And then finally, there are the suburban corridors. These are located along major arterials in areas that are going to remain car dependent into the future, not planned for future transit. These suburban corridors, they may be intensified with mixed use, they may be beautified, but they're mapped as suburban corridors because the relationship to the major roadway requires special consideration with respect to land use and zoning. And this is one of these tie-ins with Orange Code we'll talk about in the next round, how we make allowances for that condition to not burden the owners, but to attempt to infill and make these places as vibrant as possible. So the remaining urban place types are the neighborhood fabric, and this makes up nearly all of the established sector, but it's still a lot of the targeted sector as well. The lowest intensity is the suburban neighborhood fabric, and this is located in the established sector and covers nearly all of that sector. Generally, you should be familiar with this type, and here the goals are to generally retain the existing character of these neighborhoods. Next, we have the suburban mixed neighborhood fabric, also generally in the established sector. These areas tend to mix today single family townhomes, some multifamily, and they exist like this on the ground. Like the prior type, these are targeted for general preservation of character, but they're also mapped in the targeted sector where there's an intention to diversify with additional missing middle housing types and to increase affordable housing at this intersection between centers, corridors, and the core of the established sector neighborhoods. And lastly is the traditional neighborhood fabric. This is a higher intensity neighborhood fabric. It's still not nearly as intense as a corridor, but these areas mix many housing types together into a tapestry of walkable blocks and open spaces. So these are really encouraged within the targeted sector as places to have a great deal of diversity in housing connected to corridors and mixed use centers. And that actually has an opportunity to absorb quite a lot of housing affordability, both naturally affordable and other means of providing housing affordability. So those prior slides demonstrate the intent of place types as future land use categories. So now we'll look at some examples of how they could be applied to real places. The first example is not in this market area, but it's a very clear example that demonstrates the urban place type categories of center, corridor, and neighborhood fabric. Of course, the question on Severin came earlier. So this is where East Severin connects with OBT. Some of the area is incorporated, but for the moment, we're going to ignore that just for the clarity of the diagram. This area demonstrates some common characteristics. There's an automobile-oriented commercial properties. These are located along the larger roads on Semarin and OBT, along with larger shopping centers at the major intersections. But beyond these commercial properties, there's a wide range of housing, some large and small lot single family, some townhome, and some multifamily. This is a sector map for that area. Pretty simple. Most properties are in the established sector, with the targeted sector along the major roadways. Plus, up on North Thompson, you'll see a small node of existing commercial there that is a potential neighborhood center. So here's a look at the boundary between targeted and established sector on the aerial backdrop. If you can see, there's a dark black line sort of on the edge of Semarin between the neighborhoods. The targeted sector follows mostly the commercial properties along major roadways, and single family is beyond in the neighborhood, in the established sector. So we'll keep that boundary on as we look at a potential place type map. So this is a map of place types for the area. The outline of the targeted sector, you'll see coincides with the difference in the oranges and reds. Within the targeted sector are the higher growth place types, the centers, corridors, and the traditional neighborhood fabric. And in the established beyond are the lower growth types, the suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. So if we just pull them out one by one, these are the centers. Two of these we may categorize as urban centers because they're quite large agglomerations of properties. Again, though applied on the individual property basis, mapping the place types, there are goals here for size because the size and depth of properties and agglomeration of properties really determine what you can do with them. So these urban centers are areas of commercial and multifamily that are large enough to develop the structure of blocks and civic spaces, and they can accommodate both mixed use and higher intensity residential infill. They're in the targeted sector. Now the neighborhood center up on North Thompson, on the other hand, is much smaller and located surrounded by the established sector. This can accommodate a small amount of mixed use infill, but needs to remain compatible with the surrounding neighborhood fabric, thus being a neighborhood center as opposed to an urban center. Here's the corridors. They're commercial and multifamily properties that are located along major roadways, again, Semarin and OBT. But these are not included within the centers. The centers are collections that are substantial and can be a sort of center of activity, have a weight of vibrancy, and the corridors connecting them. So in this case, both roadways are planned for future transportation improvements. So these are both considered transit corridors. The transit corridors encourage more residential and mixed use infill than suburban and Main Street corridors do. And so the remaining area is all neighborhood fabric, the majority of the properties really. And that fabric is divided into suburban in light yellow, suburban mixed in light orange, and traditional in dark orange. These are differentiated by density and also a mix of housing types, where the suburban neighborhood fabric is the lowest density and the traditional neighborhood fabric is the higher of the three. Yet all are lower than the corridors and centers. So it sort of steps down in intensity. So here's what it looks like when you remove the incorporated areas. It's much more difficult to discern the pattern. And so the sector and place type mapping in situations like this has been designed with consideration for the incorporated lands as the county unincorporated lands fits into them. They're then removed from the map like here. So the sector and place type maps here are in draft today. They're going to be shared on the Vision 2050 website in the coming months. And there are options, as we'll see shortly when we take a look at an example in Boggy Creek. A number of areas will certainly be subject to focus engagement to determine the most appropriate locations for sectors and place types. But before we look at that specific area in Boggy Creek, let's take a look at Taft. It's a little simpler. This area includes a large amount of housing and a traditional grid of streets, but the housing is surrounded by huge amounts of industrial, with the airport just to the east and the 528 Turnpike intersection just to the west. The sector map illustrates the condition, with the special sector in purple occupying most of the map. These are the industrial areas. The established sector covers nearly all of the existing neighborhood fabric. However, the targeted sector is assigned to properties between existing neighborhood fabrics on either side of Orange Ave. And the intent is for that targeted sector to stitch the neighborhood fabric together by transitioning the area from industrial use into a neighborhood center and supportive housing. So the goal of the sector map should be clearly to connect rather than divide, whereas today there's a lot of industrial or industrial adjacent uses there. So the black line here on this aerial is the boundary of the targeted sector. You should be able to see in the background of the aerial that the uses are very heavily automotive and industrial in that area, a dividing line in the neighborhood. And so the line identifies most of these properties, the industrial properties in between, and they're intended to become a center that connects, yet the other surrounding areas remain industrial. So here's the map of place types for the area. Again, pointing out the black line of the targeted sector. Within this are the higher growth types, centers, corridors, and traditional fabric. In the established sector are the lower growth types, suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. Here's the center. This could be a neighborhood center. This could be an urban center. I think those decisions are up for discussion and engagement. But due to the small size of blocks and the small scale of the area, we marked it as a neighborhood center at present. It can accommodate a good amount of mixed-use infill, but it certainly needs to be compatible with the surrounding neighborhood fabric. Now to the north and south are the corridors. Like the previous example, we're looking just at transit corridors because Orange Ave happens to be also intended for future transit. And actually today we'll mostly see just the transit corridors because you have a lot of them planned. So property along that route are marked as part of the transit corridor, which is, again, the sort of higher intensity residential with light mixed use along transportation ways. And special sector is the rest of the area of the industrial types. And then the neighborhood fabric. The deeper orange is traditional fabric. That's in the targeted sector, a higher intensity than surrounding. And the remaining is generally in suburban mixed neighborhood fabric with a little bit of suburban where the lots are quite large. So the composite map is like this. Within the incorporated areas here are taken out. But unlike the prior example, because the incorporated areas are much simpler, they're all essentially special sector. We didn't need to map those to really understand the place types that are working in this area. So in the last example, before we get to questions on the types, we'll look at Boggy Creek. We saved this one because it will demonstrate two potential future options. As these maps are a work in progress, this area, as discussed, will have additional meeting to discuss, debate, and choose the desired future sector and place type assignments. For today, this example is intended to demonstrate how sectors and place types may be applied to direct two different future outcomes. So option one retains the rural character of most of the Boggy Creek area, only intensifying along Boggy Creek Road where future transportation investments are intended. The sector map identifies properties along the road as targeted sector. A sliver of established sector provides a transition on the east side before getting into the rural sector. So this would result in development along the roadway, which is currently in the process of widening, and then a transition to lower intensities towards the east and to the current rural condition beyond. The black line here, like the others, is the boundary of the targeted sector, demonstrated the growth area, while the majority of the land to the east can remain rural. So option 2 may not look a lot different. We'll look at them all together at the end. Option 2 transitions the Boggy Creek area from rural to a more urban condition. Though not heavily, you could target the whole thing if you're just in the world of examples. It's not a very urban condition, but more so than today. The targeted sector here is increased to add more traditional neighborhood fabric, so it's a little wider, and that's higher intensity than the suburban fabric. The remainder of the eastern portion here is now mapped in established sector rather than rural. In most places, the established sector means character similar to the existing, but in this case, mapped on a rural area would intend to transition that area to increase the number and diversity of houses, but not necessarily at a high density. So the black line here is a boundary of the targeted sector, and the red line here is the boundary of the targeted sector of option 1, just to see, it's just a couple properties in to fill out the block. It's not that different. The extent of the established sector on the east, however, is the bigger change from the level of the sector. Here's option 1 again, the more rural option, just as a reminder. Here's the place type map with labels for the different sectors. The rural sector is mapped with the rural settlement, reflecting the existing condition. The established sector transitions to a suburban mixed-use fabric, or suburban mixed neighborhood fabric, before the center transit corridor and traditional neighborhood fabric along Boggy Creek Road. So here are the types. An urban center at Lake Nona as Boggy Creek heads north to the airport. And at the bottom, there's another center, a neighborhood center, as Boggy Creek makes that turn to Simpson Road and heads west. The corridor is a transit corridor, as the others, which is planned for future transit. And suburban mixed neighborhood fabric transitions the intensity from the Boggy Creek corridor to the rural settlement. I do want to note, though, that while the creek doesn't show here, it's still protected from development both in policy and in zoning. This is where it may be part of the sector, but when we get to the place type, that would be a natural area. So back to option 2, recall that the targeted sector is a little wider while the east is in the established sector, and the rural sector is like it's in the established sector instead of the rural sector, like the first option. So here's a place type map with labels for the different sectors. As mentioned, the east is established. And these are the types shown. Similar to option 1, except the eastern fabric is suburban mixed neighborhood with traditional neighborhood fabric transitioning to the transit corridor along Boggy Creek. So just to compare, and this is an example of how the sector mapping can be a little bit different, and the place type mapping can be a little bit different to direct a different future outcome. We want to demonstrate that they work together. The sector has subsets of place types. And in this particular example, again, that this will be revisited with the neighbors for input in terms of what the future should be. So the draft sector and place type maps, they'll be available on the Vision 2050 website in the coming months with opportunities for input. So today, we've covered a lot of ground in growth management policy, but we wanted to keep it simple so that there's a good understanding of the sectors and place types. There will be a survey shared to capture feedback, as well as other surveys on the 2050 website. And in the next series of town halls, we'll jump into the code, into some of the nerdy details and its connection with the comprehensive plan policies. But for now, we'll go back to clarifications and questions from Zoom, social media, and the county or our consultant team. Marina?
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to launch into a quick question that may help address some of the questions we're seeing coming in. which I'm going to direct at you, Matt. The first one is the character. Can you describe a little more what would go into the definition of the different place types in terms of housing density, for example, and how zoning would tie into that? Because we are getting questions such as, how will this help? How will this plan help battle resident backlash to any residential types developing at higher densities in their current neighborhoods? Or questions such as, will this, due to the increase in long duration car trips, will this plan encourage development which has live, work, play components to it? So I think speaking to that would help really show that this is in a targeted area. It's targeted areas only in which we're really trying to see a diversity of building types.
Sure. So first, what is in the place type in terms of policy, and what falls into place types and policy are some of the normal things. Density and intensity. Density, of course, is the limit on dwelling units per acre, and intensity is the floor area ratio, the sort of equivalent on the commercial side. So those limit how much can be built. Now, other controls are height and character. Height, the average building heights, and character really is related to the type of place that it's intended to be. Is this a place for walking? Is this a place that's supposed to be intensive with pedestrians and bikes, or is it more auto oriented? Now, most of the types that we've seen are aimed to be an intensive walkable place with a mixture of uses, though not all of them. Some of the neighborhood fabric, for example, the suburban neighborhood fabric, while has streets that you can walk on, does not have destinations along them, or the suburban corridor. However, the centers, those are intended for a significant mix of uses. Now, when we get into Orange Code, there we've done a few things, one of which is to simplify the different uses. So right now, your zoning code has a ton of uses. I mean, a ton. And one of the things that does is it makes it hard to change from one use to the other, and gets very specific in terms of what is allowed. And instead of looking so closely at use, it's part of it. The code looks at the form of the buildings, their height, their setbacks, how they sit on the property, how they mixed uses within them to establish compatibility. Now, the place types, those control character in a couple of ways. One is, as I described, in what they intend to be as a place, a high intensity mixed use place, or a neighborhood with a mix of housing types and a great degree of diversity in price ranges, or a neighborhood that's remaining in its current character. Now, they also control the mixture of zones that are applicable within the zoning code. And so that mixture of zones then controls the mixture of uses. It's like a cascade from, the sectors controlling the place types, controlling the zones, which then specify the specific use. Can I have a restaurant here, for example? Now, most of these are essentially any commercial property. Most commercial properties are aimed to be transitioned to mixed use in most of this. Of course, there are some exceptions in the special sector, special place types that are generally single use or of a very specific use category, like for example, a university. There may be some residences on a university, but it's not exactly a mixed use center. But the centers and corridors are generally intended to be mixed use in nature. Now, for most places, you may have a shopping center today, a large parking lot out front, commercial uses in the back. The goal is to increase housing on those sites and the diversity of uses so that they can become walkable places. And that includes adding streets and blocks, but also open spaces or civic space, actually. So we use the term civic space to define open spaces that are public in nature for people to gather. And that is something that in terms of goals is in the place type in the comprehensive plan. So we, let's say an urban center, we want this to be a high intensity mixed use place that's comprised of these 3 zoning categories and this type of civic space. And those establish the goals that then carry through to the zoning code and affect what can be developed on a single property or a collection of properties.
So the answer is yes, this plan does encourage live, work, play, shop.
If that's all you're looking for, Marina.
No, I'm just kidding. But to get to the question about yes, generally this plan is intended to encourage as Matt explained, different intensities of mixed use in most areas, in the corridors and in the centers, and then slightly more intensity of housing typologies in some of the different neighborhood fabrics.
And you also had, as part of it, was the existing residents and everything, and that's where the interaction between the established sector and the targeted sector comes into play. And the much of the purpose of the established sector is that the character is desired to be maintained. Well, there's a lot of properties along major roadways in the county that have a lot of potential capacity for infill and redevelopment. And this is really where a lot of that is targeted into those mixed use centers and corridors, but also on their edges as the neighborhoods are adjacent to them. There's a lot of areas that actually you already have a diversity of housing types, but they could be planned more efficiently. For example, well, there's the opportunity to allow those to redevelop over time. There's also a lot of capacity that is available just off of these roadways, where we'll see traditional neighborhood fabric that is mapped in, and these are really about transitioning from the higher intensity uses on corridors and centers towards the lower intensity uses in existing neighborhoods.
Yes, and to the question that talked about how will this plan help battle resident backlash to any residential types developing at higher densities in their current neighborhoods, or NIMBYism as the person questioned. I would say that the zoning code series will really get into this because what it's trying to do is encourage building forms that are compatible with each other. So often people are trying to, commercial development comes in a form that is, that conflicts with residential development, or that detracts from the character of the area, and that's why a lot of people fight it. But the goal of trying to get people to live within a 15-minute walking or biking distance or transit for some distance of their home is a very worthwhile goal. And we're seeing this movement globally around the world, but also around the country of mayors in cities really trying to ensure that, as Matt showed in some of his examples, these little neighborhood centers that could have the kind of commercial uses that people need within their neighborhoods to allow for one trip that would have otherwise been made by a car, being made by bike or transit or walking. And I think the code will speak a lot to that. I don't know if Alberto or Olin or anyone else wants to add anything to that discussion before to the whole question of NIMBYism and the whole live, work, play, shop in certain areas. I mean, it's very targeted. There's a lot of established areas, right? Where the character is going to essentially remain the same, and then be very, very specific about where new development is encouraged to come into play. And I would say that I think one map that would be very useful to see would be the future transportation routes overlaid on the sector maps that you showed, Matt, because I think it'll help people understand at least where transit's going and why the sectors and the place types are the way they are.
And Marina, I'll just like to add that if there is one leave behind from this series, it is really to better understand the approach towards the vision maps. And I'm referring to the sector maps. when we go over the specifics of those general areas, again, blurred lines, not regulatory in nature, they would set the trend of development, the diverse amount of opportunities to address all of the different development characters that we're talking about here. If there is a leave behind today, is to really take that general vision map, the sector maps, and really understand that if an area is targeted, yes, the reason why today those particular areas have been identified as targeted is because there is a very high percentage of the existing parcels that are either undeveloped or underdeveloped and could transform and evolve into becoming something else. Everything included in the topics today, mix of uses, higher densities of residential areas, and proximity to transit and proximity to employment centers. That, in a nutshell, is really that targeted sector. When we talk about other areas that become transitional along the edges of a targeted and established, there are opportunities there in the suburban mix place types where very well calculated place types could apply as long as they follow the policy rules that are about to be established, where there may be opportunities for higher density of residential as long as that solution is compatible to the surrounding context of that neighborhood itself. So we just need to understand that we are talking about a planning process that is very different than the way that the conversation has been held in the past. It's no longer about separation of uses. It's not only about single uses being master planned, but it's about opportunities to create much more desirable and vibrant places that are not disruptive, but are engaging into a future planning process that will be much more predictable than it has been in the past.
That's right. Thank you. And I think, as Matt's example showed for the Boggy Creek Road, that there's it's necessary to get community input in terms of how the residents who live there see the community evolving and transitioning. And as you saw in the examples, there's a lot of choice. But it's not only, but to add to what you were describing, Alberto, it's also about increasing the options, the housing options that are available to people. And there's a question here that says, what form of residences, high-rise, multifamily, single-use residential, are preferred by the end users who are driving the growth? It seems like the plan is trying to capture residential in a more high-rise, mixed-use manner. Is that what the demand is telling us? And I would think that no, the demand is not telling you that. What the demand is telling you is that there are areas that are more appropriate for high-end residential and areas that are more appropriate for single-family residential. And what this plan is trying to do is to identify where those areas occur and where communities and neighborhoods are comfortable with understanding that where the transit corridors are happening, high-end residential is perfectly appropriate. But there's a lot of people who don't want to live in high-end residential, or just residential in general, high-rise, I should say, not high-end, any more than there are those people who don't want to necessarily live in a single-family home. And so what we hope the zoning code is going to do is provide you, and that's the next missing link, but provide you with the range of options and provide property owners and developers with the range of housing types that exist that we used to build and we sort of that have disappeared out of our lexicon because zoning made it too difficult. Those are the townhouses, the duplexes, the triplexes, the small walk-up apartments that may have 4 to 6 units per building, that don't require structured parking, that can park on their site, that can be, that are very compatible with the single family homes that may surround them. And then of course there will be some areas where there just may be smaller cottages or smaller homes surrounded by larger homes. So the county has that wide range of characteristics, which is what this first series was really trying to show, the richness of the different characters and the richness of the that needs to be preserved, enhanced, and densified. I don't know if Matt or Alberto want to add to that question about building types.
Well, I think it's easy to be distracted by, high rise, which are certainly parts of the centers, and the transit corridors. But that's not all of it, and that's a level of focus as we get into Orange Code is are the zones where a different level of housing are permitted, and that's actually a part of a number of the centers and the corridors, which is to allow, as you said, the townhouses and duplexes and smaller multifamily units that are not requiring a parking deck. So as a system that sort of builds upon itself, there are some places where the market demand can support structured parking, is going to support that sort of intensity. And then there's the areas in between that aren't. And so rather than necessarily direct, we're not directing high rise everywhere. And even in those centers, the goal is to transition to adjacent areas from the higher intensity down to a lower intensity. That's expressed quite a bit through zoning, but the goal there has been to expand the number of housing types available.
And just to add, on the other end of the spectrum, and a constant comment that we have received from the first series of participants in that first series is the importance of this vision to also pay very close attention to natural environment and the preservation of the natural environment as we begin to intertwine, if you would, existing beauty of that character into the very sensitive approach towards those edges and what needs to happen in order to transition from the natural into a much more dense and intense area. And I think that's the beauty about this overall planning process, is that it takes all of those very well calculated planning principles into consideration as we continue to draft this approach.
That's right. Thank you, Alberto. And so I think the next three questions have to do with place-specific areas. I'm going to direct one to Matt, and then I'm going to ask you to talk to the other two, because I think the one I want to have Matt answer first really has to do with the role that uses has in ascribing a typology. But the question is, how many residents will the new growth sector accommodate? I think we've spoken to that, but understand that a large portion of the I-4 corridor will consist of commercial/industrial areas. Do you want to address that, Matt, briefly, in terms of just a brief introduction to how we're not going to be as concerned about use and more concerned about form?
Oh, sure. Well, if I look back to some of the examples we've looked at, let's say you have an existing shopping center, which is a pretty common condition. They tend to occupy a lot of land, but be in places that have greater access to transit and so forth. Now, those places are limited in terms of what they can have within them. Very specific standards for each of the commercial uses, but they're generally not allowed to have any residential uses in there. But what we've seen as a trend elsewhere, and some demand even here in Orange County, are for the owners to slowly over time infill those shopping centers. Now, when you have a future land use like you do today, it's very hard to do, and so it happens quite slowly, because you have to go through a year of changing your future land use category, and then guess what? The zoning code doesn't allow either. So you have to go through a PD process to get something done, and instead what we're doing here is to not separate uses, but to mix them together and regulate based on intensity. So intensity is both the mixture of uses, how many uses are allowed to mix together, and essentially what's the intensity of building, how high, how big. And so there are areas of greater intensity, both in mix of uses that are allowed. You can mix lots of things and you can build big buildings, and then there are areas in between where you can build medium-sized buildings with just a few uses, and then there are the areas further which essentially become the single-family only areas. But it's that spectrum of intensity that gets us out of this mindset of, well, this is a shopping center and it's only ever going to be a shopping center, or this is a warehouse use and it can't redevelop. But some of that is because the controls as they are today make it very difficult for them to redevelop. And so the goal here is to loosen up those controls, but to direct them in terms of a vision. That's a trade-off we'll talk about when we get into the code, where the code will, to one side, demand more specific outcomes, but on the other side, be much more easier to use from, say, the landowner's perspective or developer's perspective, but then also from the resident to be able to understand what the expectation is coming out of development. So as a result, there's quite a lot of housing that you can fit in these places, and you need that housing to make the non-residential uses viable.
Thank you, Matt. So I think I'm going to ask Alberto to answer the next question. I won't make it so specific, but someone is talking about the Williamsburg neighborhood, and their biggest concern is the overgrowth of human population that is destroying the wildlife land in these areas. And so they want to see more WOA areas. And so maybe, talking a little bit about the goals of the preservation sectors as well is an important part of this discussion.
Yeah, and I think it's really important when we talk about neighborhoods such as Williamsburg and the relationship to areas that are targeted for the highest dense and intense vision plan that 2050 has to offer. How do you continue to have established neighborhood, at the level of historical context that it has, and continue to take advantage of the natural conditions of the wetlands and natural environment that become an amenity for that particular neighborhood itself. So being able to identify the policies for coexistence of these two very dynamic and opposite ends of the transit zones, if you would, single family, detached, in the established sector versus the targeted sector that would provide mix of uses, transit, and what happens in that space in between. That needs to be very well drafted as part of this plan as well, to be able to continue to provide reassurance to those residents that whatever happens close to their environs is already part of the vision and it's not a surprise. And I think that the elimination of that element of surprise because of the fear of encroachment is something that we need to plan and be very, very blunt about the way that 2050 continues to develop.
Great. And as we come up on the hour, I just want to make one final comment, which will lead to the next question. I'll let Matt and you, Alberto, have the last word. But the questions are, is the draft targeted sector delineation available for review? And is there a document that summarizes these types that people can review? And they will be, except we didn't want to show the place types mapped accurately yet. First, because we do want public input, but two, is history has shown us that when you show people what place type exists over their property, that's all they focus on. And we really wanted to give Matt, which I think was really nicely done, an opportunity to explain the logic and the methodology behind how these sectors and place types were allocated, so that people could really understand them before they go and now really have a good discussion about, well, where does it make sense to target growth in our market area, and where does it make sense to have the WOA areas and so on and so forth. So maybe you can speak to when these maps will be available, Alberto, and I'll leave you and Matt have the last word, but I wanted to thank you both.
Sure, Marina, thank you. Just to reemphasize the approach here, which is really the opportunity that we're engaging everybody. The opportunity tonight and in the past several months has been us, the team, the Orange County staff, the consultants, and those that are participating continue to develop and be very specific about the approach, this different lens that I'm referring to, the way that we're planning differently, a little bit more predictable and simpler, if you would, in a way. And that has not been completed. That is in the making at this particular time. As Marina mentioned, we are in the process of continuing to receive the outcome of those surveys, the questions that are continue to come our way, and the recommendations that are being shared today as well. So anything that is in draft format, it is just that, in a very, very drafty draft format. And we don't anticipate, we can share with you at different stages the progress of this, and you will continue to see an evolution of change, but we don't anticipate having downloadable maps from the web page until perhaps the beginning of the summer, when we finish the third series, when we would have had a little bit more engaged conversation at different levels, not only with the community at large, but also focus groups of those residents that are wanting to better understand the planning process. And we will have all of those unveiled within the next several months. So just stay tuned. We have your information. Those of you that have been participating, we will be sending out updates as to what could be accessed from our webpage. And we welcome a continued engagement throughout this process, because that's what's going to determine the final draft.
Alberto, this is Marcos. I just wanted to add, because I wrote an answer here, and as the questions were coming, I was asked to answer this specific question of the sector maps. And I mentioned that we would post them on the website. So as of the date, I'll defer obviously to you and whenever we have them ready. But we're currently working on those maps, and they will become available through the website. And I wanted just to make clear that as they get published, it doesn't mean that they are final. They will be published for public review, right? So even when these maps are published, it doesn't mean until they become official and are approved, they are considered to be for public review.
Thank you, Marcos. And
well, the only thing that I was going to add, Marina, was the website address again. So
well,
people have
survey,
that,
right? Because isn't there a survey we're asking people to stay on and take?
Yes, precisely. Once this meeting ends, people who are part of it on Zoom, please just hang out, and you'll be sent to a small feedback form, and that'll also be posted on I think on Facebook and on Twitter. But then also please go to the Vision 2050 website, where there are opportunities to get involved in another survey, a much more detailed survey, and those sorts of opportunities will be posted on the site.
And Matt, can you let people know when the next meetings are coming up for this series? It will be a repetition of tonight's for the most part, except for the specific area plans. But
Wednesday and Thursday this week, and next Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday again next week. But I wanted to, before we hang up, I wanted to first thank you all, for those of you who actually stayed on for this, what is often a very dry presentation. I think Matt made it very interesting. But we also really want to thank the commissioners who stayed on for this presentation, and wanted to know if any of you had any final thoughts or words that you wanted to share, if this resonated with you at all, or if you can find ways to encourage your constituents to attend, that would be great as well.
We are going to, from District 1 office, we are going to continue to get the word out. I actually was extremely encouraged to see how much participation and the extremely on-point questions from our residents. It just goes to show you that everyone, I think, we keep moving this forward and people will stay engaged. I definitely can see a lot of avenues for future discussion, and I appreciate everyone's time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Well, then that's a lovely way to end. Thank you all for participating. And for those who really are code nerds, like many of us, please come and join us again tomorrow. No, sorry. Wednesday and then Thursday. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye.